The Last Shogun by Ryotaro Shiba. This is a work of historical fiction. I've always been a huge historical fiction fan. Like, I love history, but I also really love novels. So I love learning history through novels. In fact, I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but a lot of my knowledge of ancient Rome comes from reading historical novels. Things like I, Claudius or Cully McCullough's Master of Rome series, or, there are just tons of historical novels about ancient Rome. This is a historical novel about Japan, which I actually bought when I was in Japan. I bought the English translation, so this was translated into English, but it's by Japanese author Ryotaro Shiba, or as he's known in Japan, Shiba Ryotaro, because they, switched the names around. Yeah. I didn't actually know who this guy was when I bought this book. I was just in the bookstore. I saw this was in English. I bought it kind of as an impulse. But since then, through talking with Japanese friends, I became aware that Ryotaro Shiba is a very famous historical novelist in Japan. Unfortunately, very few of his stuff has been translated into English, which I guess is why he's so little known in the English world. I think this book and maybe a couple others, but if you go to his Wikipedia page, he's written a massive amount of historical novels. And somewhat unfortunately, his most famous historical novel is Ryoma ga Yuku in Japanese. I think it means Ryoma goes forward, or Ryoma goes his own way, which is about Sakamoto Ryoma, who was a very influential figure during the Meiji Restoration in Japan. A very interesting figure. He's been at times called like the Thomas Jefferson of Japan. And it's a very famous novel, historical novel in Japanese. When I was living in Japan, it was not translated into English. I was actually, right before I filmed this video, I was searching online to see, because, I left Japan about 10 years ago. So I was just Googling it to see if maybe in the last 10 years somebody changed their mind and translated it into English. And sure enough, I Googled it, and it's in the process of being translated into English right now. I guess I never realized how long it was. It was 4 volumes. Somebody translated the first volume into English. The website I was reading, it made it sound like it was being done by a fan. So in other words, no publishing house had commissioned it, but there was just a fan who really wanted this translated into English. According to the website, they said that no publishing house had wanted to translate it into English because apparently publishing houses thought that English audiences would not be interested in this 4-volume historical novel about Sakamoto Ryoma. But I think I would be. So, maybe once all 4 translations get done, I'll check it out. Anyways, sorry, all of that is background about this author. It's not about this book in particular. So this book is about the last Shogun. Now, the Shogun was it was kind of like a military dictator, but essentially it was the ruler of Japan for about 200 years until the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is, the Last Samurai, the whole kind of that Tom Cruise movie, or that era where the emperor took power again and then the shogun was out of power. And so this is the story of the guy who was the guy in the last line in a line of shoguns. I bought this because I was interested in historical fiction, although after I bought it and I took it home and I was reading the translator's preface, the translator said, actually, maybe it's not really historical fiction. He said, maybe it's just a history. Apparently in Japanese, it's classified as historical fiction. Maybe that's more the conventions in Japanese, and I don't know, maybe that's because Ryotaro Shiba is a historical novelist, so kind of everything he writes gets classified as historical fiction. But it's not really The translator's preface says it's really more of a history that occasionally just uses some literary devices. Like it pretends to know what the characters are thinking, but there's no invented scenes, there's no fictionalized scenes, or there's no fictionalized conversations. It's more just kind of like a history that's told in a narrative style. So I guess you could, depending on how you want to classify this, you could classify it as a really boring historical fiction, like a really dry novel, or a really lively history. Either way. There's a temptation to compare this to the Chinese film, The Last Emperor, because this is the last shogun. And some comparisons are relevant. I mean, aside from the fact that I'm comparing a book with a movie. But both of them are about the last monarch in the line of monarchs. And both of them are also not about the life of the monarch so much as the end of an era, which is viewed through the eyes of the person who happened to be the last monarch in power. But that's about where the similarities end, because unlike the last emperor, the last shogun was actually not born into power. In fact, the first half of the book is how he came into power in the first place, because he was not straight in the line of succession. He was somebody very much on the outside who looked very unlikely to ever become shogun. In fact, from that respect, the first half of the book reminded me of a different historical novel, I, Claudius, by Robert Graves, which, if you're familiar with I, Claudius, is a historical novel about the Roman Emperor Claudius, who also looked like he was he was in the imperial family, but he was kind of the person in the imperial family who was least likely to become emperor. There were all these people ahead of him, and he was kind of looked upon as an idiot anyways. But then through a series of events, he ended up getting thrust into the position in spite of that. So this is, the beginning of the book is kind of similar to that. Somebody who's got not likely to have a claim to the throne, or a very distant claim to the throne, but through a series of events ends up inheriting it in spite of all that. Now, I am largely unacquainted with Japanese history. I mean, I know it in the broad strokes, what I picked up from my college survey class. I had no idea it was so complicated. There are all these different clans that, I thought it was just like the shogun, and the shogun was in power just like the king. But it turns out there are all these different clans that have to be negotiated with to figure out which shogun is going to be in power. And then there are different factions within the clans. There's all this backstage scheming. There are all these changing alliances. It really got complicated. I had no idea the Meiji Restoration was so complicated. Now, for a history nerd, admittedly, some of this is part of the fun. Really just kind of diving in and getting into the thick of all the political intrigue. But it's also quite confusing. The author himself acknowledges this in the afterword. So this is quoting the author's afterwards. He says, "The Last Shogun is not a story that lends itself easily to retelling. He was a politician, and few books with politicians as their subject have met with any success. Politicians can exist only in the midst of political events, and can therefore be understood only amid the whirl of politics. Page after page of detailed political information must precede a few lines portraying the man at the center of events." So that's the difficulty in writing a book like this. It's also, if you're a history nerd, part of the appeal. But this book did require a lot of attention from me. In other words, it wasn't something I could read casually. even though it was at least marketed as a historical novel. I was constantly having to flip back and forth to remind myself of who this person was or who this person was. There were all these different names and clans and alliances. And to make it worse, they were all Japanese names. Now, this is unavoidable. If you're going to read a book about Japanese history, it's going to be Japanese names. But you know, it's a funny thing, and I've noticed this when I've been living in different countries. Foreign names are a lot harder to remember than English names. You know, like if the characters are Tom, Dick, and Harry, I can remember that perfectly. I know who Tom is, I know who Dick is, I know who Harry is. But if the characters are Iseda, Iesu, and Ayoshi, then I'm like, wait. Who is who again? It's unavoidable. You know, it's unavoidable when you're reading Japanese history, but it is an extra obstacle to get over with in a book like this. That being said, this could have been alleviated a little bit if the translator just had a consistent way of referring to each character. Or I don't know, maybe this is the author's fault. But the translator maybe could have cleaned it up. Because each paragraph, like if we encounter a character in one paragraph, he's referred to by his given name in one paragraph, and then by his family name in the next. The narrative keeps changing how they're referring to the character, which confused me even more. Also, I would have loved an index to help me keep track of the characters. I mean, like I said, it's a historical novel, kind of, and I guess historical novels don't usually have indexes the way a hard history would have. But I would have loved an index. There was a list at the front of all the characters in the book. But for one, it's incomplete. It wasn't all the characters. And two, it didn't give page numbers. Like, when a name popped up again, I had this urge to go back through the previous pages and remind myself who he was and why he was important to the story again. And I couldn't do that without anything like an index. All that being said, these were some minor complaints that I had along the way. Despite these frustrations, it didn't stop me from enjoying the book and from more or less largely understanding what was happening. I had to work at it. I had to be constantly flipping back in the book and reminding myself what had been happening 20 pages before. But I got there in the end. So this is, if you're interested in history, this is a fascinating book. If you're not interested in history, do not pick up this book. But then you wouldn't anyways, right? If you're not interested in history, you'd never pick up a book called The Last Shogun anyways. So that problem probably solves itself.